of these proposals by filibustering. It's especially disappointing that some who claim to support regular order, a transparent legislative process, accord that process no deference. You know, Mr. President, there are only 100 of us who have the privilege to serve at any given time.
All of this in our video library at cspan.org. We'll leave this. The House is gaveling in for debate on 3 bills and a tribute to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
Or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 254.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 13, H.R. 254, a bill to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to facilitate the development of hydroelectric power on the Diamond Fork system of the Central Utah Project.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
H.R. 254, introduced by Congressman Jason Chaffetz of Utah, facilitates the development of 50 megawatts of clean and renewable hydroelectric power at existing Interior Department facilities in the Diamond Fork system in Utah. That is enough electricity to power over 50,000 homes. This bill removes an administrative impediment to make this happen. As part of the Interior Department's current rules, the developer must first pay $106 million even before investing in the capital cost to install hydropower generators. As Water and Power Subcommittee Chairman Tom McClintock said, this requirement is akin to a family renting out a room, but first requiring the renter to pay off their mortgage. The family is then shocked that nobody wants to rent from them, and the family is not further along in paying off its mortgage and has denied itself rental income. The Congressional Budget Office concurred by stating that, quote, the federal government is unlikely under current law to develop the hydropower resources of the Diamond Fork project for at least the next 10 years, unquote. Therefore, this bill removes the requirement for paying for the sunk cost and encourages non-federal entities to pursue hydropower development at Diamond Fork. As a result, this legislation will generate $4 million in revenue over a 10-year period. The House has passed this legislation twice in as many Congresses, and I urge my colleagues to support it again. And, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
And I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 254, introduced by my friend Mr. Chaffetz of Utah, would allow for the production of hydropower at existing facilities by deferring the debt associated with hydropower development on the Diamond Fork system, as you have heard. This would facilitate the development of 50 megawatts of clean hydroelectric power while generating revenue for the government for the use of the water facilities. And this is what we should want to see. And so I ask my colleagues to support its passage, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. And I want to thank the bipartisan support that we've had in the passage of this legislation and urge its support. H.R. 254 is a win for federal taxpayers, the environment, and energy users. This bill allows for the development of 50 megawatts of clean, renewable hydropower on the Diamond Fork system in Utah and will generate $600,000 per year for the federal government. In Utah, we're one of the fastest growing areas in the nation, and we need this power. Under current law, hydropower will not be developed on the Diamond Fork system due to a requirement that the energy developers pay $106 million to recover sunk costs that were incurred several years ago. This $106 million payment requirement renders the hydro project hydropower project economically unfeasible, and according to the Congressional Budget Office doing an assessment on H.R. 254, said, quote, among the reasons the CBO expects the site will probably not be developed over the next 10 years under the current law is a requirement that project sponsors pay the Treasury for a portion of the federal government's previous investments in their water project, end quote. H.R. 254 would waive the replacement requirement, making the project economically feasible. In addition, the developer would pay the federal government a $600,000 per year fee unrelated to the sunk cost once the project is completed. Massive amounts of energy are generated in the Diamond Fork unit as water flows downhill from Strawberry Reservoir to the Utah and Salt Lake valleys. Energy dissipators are scattered throughout the pipeline to slow the flow and disperse the energy. Under H.R. 254, the operators would be able to replace those dissipators with turbines, allowing the currently wasted energy to be converted into electricity. With or without this bill, the federal government will not recover the $106 million under any realistic scenario. Developers would not create 50 megawatts of renewable hydropower unless the sunk cost repayment requirement is waived. Additionally, the federal government will receive $600,000 per year once the project is completed if the repayment requirement is waived. This has had a number of hearings within the Natural Resources Committee. We appreciate the bipartisan support and spirit of this moving forward. I'd urge the passage by my colleagues. We need the energy. This is the best clean way we can do it. And with that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Does the gentleman from Virginia have further speakers?
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers.
With that, I will repeat my advice to my colleagues that we support this legislation, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I concur with the gentleman from New Jersey in that this bill should pass, and I appreciate the bipartisan support. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 254? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on this, I ask a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
Yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman of Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1033.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 17, H.R. 1033, a bill to authorize the acquisition and protection of nationally significant battlefields and associated sites of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 under the American Battlefield Protection Program.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
The American Battlefield Protection Act addressed the preservation and protection of Civil War battlefields through conservation easements or through the purchase of land from willing sellers with federal grants. H.R. 1033 renews this effort, which will soon expire, and adds Revolutionary War and War of 1812 battlefields to those eligible for protection. It is important to note that the bill we are considering mirrors the version from the last Congress that passed the House and included improvements made by the Natural Resources Committee. Specifically, the program sunset was moved up from 10 to 5 years, and we retained the existing authorization of appropriations to provide a more realistic funding level in these times of deficit spending. Additionally, the committee added language to prohibit these funds from being used for lobbying activities or for being distributed to organizations that participate in lobbying. With so many existing needs within the National Park Service, we want to ensure that these funds go specifically for battlefield protection and not outside advocacy. I would also like to point out that this legislation does not fund advocacy or educational seminars and programs. These grants are strictly available to state and local governments for battlefield protection. There is a separate and distinct federal authorization for educational programs and partnership that is not part of this bill. Mr. Speaker, with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of this battlefield that Mr. Whitman and I have brought to the committee and now to the floor, the American Battlefields Protection Program Amendments Act. From Lexington, where the shot still reverberates, to Gettysburg, the site of the battle described so brilliantly and concisely by Lincoln, to the stories of the American Revolution and the Civil War, it is at the battlefields that we bring to life the ideals of liberty and democracy fostered by our nation's founders. History is best experienced by those who can touch it, feel it, live it. And the battlefields of the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War provide a unique opportunity for Americans to experience where and how the epic struggle for our nation's independence and identity took place. Unfortunately, urbanization, suburban sprawl, unplanned commercial and residential development are constantly encroaching on the many significant battlefields that are still extant from the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. This encroachment poses a severe and growing risk to the preservation of these historically significant sites. Congress recognized this danger to our shared history and in the late 1990s created the American Battlefield Protection Program, a competitive grant program that matches federal dollars with private money to preserve Civil War sites. Since Congress first appropriated funding for this program, it has helped to save more than 17,000 acres of hallowed ground in 14 states. Again, encouraging private funds for acquiring land from willing sellers. The bill before us today, H.R. 1033, would build on the success of the American Battlefield Protection Program in preserving Civil War battlefield sites and would authorize this program, reauthorize this program, and extend the protection and preservation to battlefields from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. H.R. 1033 would allow officials in the American Battlefield Protection Program to collaborate with state and local governments and nonprofit organizations to preserve and protect the most endangered historical sites and provide up to 50% of the cost of purchasing the battlefield land threatened by sprawl and commercial development. Again, from willing sellers, encouraging the use of private funds. Previously, this legislation has been approved 3 times by this House with overwhelming bipartisan support, mostly unanimous. In a markup in the House Resources Committee last month, the American Battlefield Protection Amendments Act again passed unanimously. As the Civil War Trust said in their letter supporting this legislation, quote, "The battlefields of the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War provide a unique opportunity for Americans to experience the epic battles that helped define our nation. Preserving these American historic treasures is essential to remember the sacrifices that our ancestors made to secure our freedom and independence and preserve our republic," end quote. The ongoing bicentennial commemoration of the War of 1812 and the ongoing sesquicentennial commemoration of the Civil War means that this is an opportune time to recommit ourselves to the protection of our nation's hallowed grounds. Historical sites, once lost, are gone forever. we should act now to preserve these valuable sites. The National Park Service has done an inventory of sites around the country, and they point to many that need this protection now. I thank my colleague from Virginia for his enthusiastic support. I point out that there is strong bipartisan support for this legislation as co-sponsors and other supporters, and I urge my colleagues to join us in supporting this bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As an original co-sponsor of H.R. 1033, I would like to express my appreciation to Mr. Holt for his continued leadership to preserve and protect important historic battlefields throughout the United States, including those in his home state of New Jersey, which is better known as the crossroads of the American Revolution. As a Virginian, this legislation is also especially notable as it will continue to preserve important hallowed ground from our nation's independence and the Civil War. The Civil War Battlefield Preservation Program has been particularly beneficial to the Commonwealth of Virginia. As a result, hard-fought acres of battleground have been preserved in pivotal sites such as Appomattox, Cedar Creek, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, Manassas, Petersburg, and Richmond. Preserving battlefields does more than just honor those who fought in those battles. It protects important places from our nation's, from development. I want to make sure that we continue those efforts in assuring that we make the effort to keep these battlefields in their proper place in this nation's history. I also would like to emphasize that this program doesn't increase the amount of federal land. I know there's been some criticism to say, well, this is an effort to increase federal land within this program. While it does increase and expand those battlefield areas that are eligible under the program, it doesn't increase the amount of federal land in this particular project. So I want to make sure that people understand that this is really for protection of battlefields outside of national park boundaries, giving concerns within those areas the ability to help preserve those lands, and there's no additional management burden on the federal government. So these lands are not going to become part of a system where we have to incur more cost to maintain those lands. It's the ability to make sure that we preserve those lands, and especially today with encroachment from development in these areas, these critical historical sites must be preserved, and this gives the flexibility and the tools for those folks in those areas that want to be able to preserve these lands, the ability to do that. So, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my good friend from Virginia and would reiterate what he has said. In fact, the original legislation, which we are reauthorizing and extending through this bill, grew out of Virginia. It was because of the critical battlefields in Virginia that were at risk of being lost that this battlefield protection legislation was developed. But it will be beneficial across many states. If you look where the War of 1812 was fought in the Deep South and around the Great Lakes, and the Revolutionary War fought up and down the 13 colonies, this is something that is of great national importance, and because the authorization is about to expire, it is needed. And because so many of these battlefields are at great risk of being overrun by sprawl and development, it is at the greatest need now. I urge my colleagues to support it, and again, I thank my friend from Virginia. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Mr. Holt said, preserving battlefields is extraordinarily important, and it does more than just honor those that have fought in the past. It's important that it protects these places that are so important in our nation's history. Preserving these battlefields contributes economically to local businesses and to historic communities in these areas across the country. And according to a recent study, in just 5 states, those states including Missouri, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, 15.8 million visitors went to these Civil War sites, and spent nearly $442 million in those local communities and supported 5,150 jobs. We talk all the time up here about jobs and the economy. This is something that we can do to improve and enhance jobs and the economy in these local communities. And we're blessed in Virginia, as Mr. Holt said, with a rich history. And according to the Virginia Tourism Corporation, Civil War site visitors stay longer and spend more than twice as much as the average visitor to the Commonwealth. Preserving battlefields is good for local communities and businesses and good for jobs and the economy. This bill continues.
For just a moment.
Yes.
And I would like to add to his economic numbers the fiscal fact that this does not appropriate any funds. We're just reauthorizing existing legislation and extending it. I thank the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The bill, again, as I said, continues a modest investment of federal resources to protect these hallowed grounds where our independence was won and our republic secured. And I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1033. And I do want to iterate what Mr. Holt said, and this legislation does not increase authorized spending. Proponents of this program sought to double the annual spending authorization and add the Revolutionary War and War of 1812 sites to those eligible for grants, but the committee made sure that there was no increase in spending and insisted that the proposal be added to keep the authorization flat at these current levels when adding additional war sites. So we wanted to make sure we had the opportunity for sites to be included, but understanding where we are with the nation's deficit, we wanted to make sure that we could preserve these sites without adding to the deficit. So I think it's a very responsible way to do that, to make sure that communities have that ability to do the things they need to do, and also making sure we keep in mind the times that we face here at the federal level. So I believe it's an extraordinarily good bill, and again, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1033, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1033? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Mr. Speaker?
Yeah, the gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, on that, I demand the yeas and nays on this bill.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking the vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.
The House is gavelled out. Members return at